kind of continuing the Global South, Verónica Tello is going to present to us Shonky Exports, an archive of neoliberalism from the margins, the losers, and the poor. And Verónica Tello is an art historian, writer, editor, teacher, and curator. And her research focuses on transnational art histories and their archives in and out of Australia, Chile, the Pacific, and Latin America. Thanks very much, Verónica.
Thank you.
Try and do it louder.
So my presentation is actually under 15 minutes, I think. So that should help us. I wanted to just say that, firstly acknowledge that we're on the land of the Darug people and that this research has also been developed on the lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people and the lands of the Mapuche people in Chile. And that I acknowledge elders past, present and future, and just want to thank the Indigenous presenters this morning in particular who really sparked some thoughts and leadership on what it means to animate and make archives, resonant and living. Things that I've been thinking about from the slightly different perspective. And so today I'll be presenting what is a work in progress, but also a work that I've been kind of chipping away at quite slowly for the last 6 years. It started as an accidental project, and it's become my obsession. And it's just since basically early this year, I've finally, I think, figured out how to shape it into a book, which is kind of what I'll be talking about today. So what I'll be doing today is sharing a lot of the archives of Chilean art and activism that I've been working on. And I'll be doing that through the video mainly, actually, because I found that the PowerPoint is an insufficient medium for showing video art, sound art, and slide art, which is the main kind of mediums that I'm working with. And so anyway, look forward to having some feedback. All right. So this project, which will be a book, seeks to tell the history of how experimental Chilean artists and writers documented and negotiated early forms of neoliberalism during the 1970s and 80s by using the archival materials they left behind in Australia. And at the center of this research, check that's playing. At the center of this research is an archive generated largely through the solidarity of exiled gay travesti Chilean artist Juan Davila. So Davila, as most of you will know, moved to Melbourne in 1974 in the immediate aftermath of the end of democracy in Chile. In the following years, he dedicated himself to helping his artist and writer friends in Santiago get their work out, performing curatorial, admin, and editorial work. The archive he amassed in Australia includes correspondence, unpublished writing, project proposals, budgets, and exhibition documentation and materials, some of which I'll show today. For 40 years, these archives, which travelled across the Pacific, remained untouched in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, the National Library in Canberra, and several other smaller art spaces across Australia. Some archives were kept intact but embargoed. Most were stored in dark corners and forgotten. For the last 6 years, I've been locating and figuring out how to approach these materials. Elusiveness, avoidance, negation, and refusal permeate them. They don't want to be seen or handled with ease. They've been largely forgotten because the Chilean diaspora in Australia is tiny, arguably insignificant. We constitute less than 0.08% of the population. Yet the existence of these archives presupposes that a history can be written. As one of the letters in the archives telegraphs, we donate these materials from Chile to a gallery in Australia for future researchers. The question is, how do we study, mediate, and write about these archives to constitute a history of the present? At the beginning of the 80s, artists and writers living in Santiago began to export their work overseas using cheap technologies of reproduction. Photographs, slides, video art, Xerox books, and mail art were circulated across the then burgeoning global art world alongside cassette tapes with sound art that chanted an anthem of refusal. No, no fue feliz. No, no, I was not happy. So I'll just play a bit. These technologies of reproduction, which circulated across exhibition circuits of international art, enabled artists and writers to critique and flee the dictatorship that emerged in Chile after 1973, even if only temporarily. From 81, Chilean artists and writers living in Santiago used the trade routes of international art and their cultural capital and status as artists, theorists, and curators to solicit invitations from the First World, travelling to biennials and festivals in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Paris, Milan, London, Washington, and Vancouver. Their restlessness and desires to roam, wander, and find errant ways to live were palpable in their exports. In the 70s and 80s, Chileans lived under a dictatorship, often understood as a testing ground for the now global logic of neoliberalism. The dictatorship wielded systemic surveillance and punishment to rework Chile's social and economic structure. While the dictatorship invested its resources to propagate an image of Chile's local and international economic success, artists and writers purposefully retooled infrastructures of capitalist production, including the news and entertainment media and commercial transport, to reroute and disseminate goods and services such as milk, welfare, and information. They seized unoccupied storefronts of buildings to recover space, establishing clandestine art galleries, writing societies, printing presses, community hubs, and murals and posters that evaded authority. And they developed documentary practices energized and fueled by the margins. At the same time, they countermapped the borderless nature of the dictatorship, which expanded and expanded across Santiago's stock exchange, the port of Valparaiso, Washington's White House, jails in Santiago, the borders of East and West Germany, and beyond during the Cold War. When transporting their work overseas, they often omitted or minimalized translations, subtitles, and contextualization for First World audiences. While they wanted to show that despite the dictatorship, the military, the police, the exile, the curfews, the inflation, and the hunger, they were still here, they also used tactics of refusal, abstraction, and opacity to lay bare how the Third World was, in their words, asynchronous in relation to international standards of contemporaneity. End quote. It was better, they insisted, to fail to be contemporary and expose the conditions that subjected them to geographical and historical abstraction. As they used these tactics of refusal, international critics saw in their work boys in white cubes, a whole bunch of nothing generating no comment. Or critics saw not the content, but the material culture of poverty, which they predictably said to be incommensurate with the professionalism and commercialism of international art exhibitions. Or they noted the clunky, tacky, blurry, shonky nature of their images, videos, and slide art, and suggested that some of this belonged in a donation bin, like cultural waste. So rather than trying to make good of these Chilean exports today, or attempting to rescue or rehabilitate them, it might be more useful to cling to the negative reception. How might they have been made in an image of failure, exile, and loss? How might they generate a history of losers, the margins, the precarious, and the poor? And how might an art history of losers and loss prevent us from sliding into an amnesiac politics of positivity and triumph over adversity, which ironically mirrors the dictatorship's own narrative? So despite the international marketing the dictatorship and every post-dictatorship government has cultivated in Chile, which is that Chile is the winner of Latin American economics, this fiction was ruptured by the explosive mass protests of late 2019, known as the Estallido Social. Embracing failure provides an alternative to passively accepting the top-down neoliberal order and presents strategies for actively negotiating, contesting, and undoing it. As the Argentinian critical theorist Verónica argues, in the history and politics of neoliberalism from below, the margins, the losers, and the poor harness and retool trade, work, technology, and entrepreneurship, shaping them into dark, shadowy, and unauthorized forms out of necessity. How else to survive? When they exported their works using mnemonic devices such as video art, sound art, etc., the Santiago scene was in effect creating an informal mobile repository of their assistance, since they knew that their international contemporaries would not get the stakes of their work. They gambled future generations might better care for their archive, hence their deposit in Australia. This project opens this message in a bottle from early neoliberalism, reconstituting the archive and giving it a new voice. So I find myself trying to figure out how to write this book. And so far, the questions I ask are, how does this archive show us how to negotiate, retool, withstand, and resist neoliberalism from the ground up? How might it generate an art and exhibition history on the side of failure rather than triumph? And what does such an art history look like? So here are some propositions that have developed so far. So a key component of this art history from below will be the politics and tensions of individualism and collectivity. In some instances, I'll analyze how the dictatorship's neoliberal economics subjectivize individuals to become entrepreneurs and shine in international art circuits. Ultimately, however, I'll be writing a history of a collective, since the Chileans did export themselves, for the most part, as a collective, to try and negate the usual art historical protocols of centering individual cultural heroes. The collective redacts individual labour, but it also generates a great density of information, condensed to the point of blurring the details of who did what, while expanding our sense of what was. Experiments in voice and structure will characterize my methodology. I see myself as a documentarian, studying and listening for signs of the past that can be animated through writing archival matter and playing with audiovisuals. I will predominantly write in the third person, referring to they, to articulate the actions of the collective, though where relevant, I'll also narrate in the first person, revealing my process. I'm still working this out, but I think I see myself as part of the we in the collective, appearing as the narrator who inherits the archive some 40 years after it was formed. At times, I'll also use the second person, addressing you when I speak about a particular individual, to maintain their anonymous status, while mirroring the writing genre most pervasive in this archive, which is the letter form or correspondence, which in essence structured the Trans-Pacific collaboration that enabled this archive to exist. So my methodology will also impact the project structure. So rather than organize the archive chronologically or with a more conventional narrative arc, I'll organize the archive around a set of discrete cultural objects salvaged from the cultural waste of loser art history. It will hold together an array of events, spaces, communities, figures, encounters, and concepts which give readers the feeling that they are dumpster diving, using their senses and capacities of detection to collect useful fragments of the past. So recovering this collective's aesthetics of poverty, the opacity, refusal, and negativity is a crucial task for art history and exhibition histories. These practices emerged during the ascendance of contemporary art, a mode of global art making and exhibiting that has dominated since the 1990s. However, the triumphalist rise of contemporary art obscures practices like those in Santiago that were not legible or liked, and therefore lack a proper account of the neoliberalism that was its precondition. Thank you.